I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am on traditional territories of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. I pay tribute to their legacy and the legacy of all First Peoples of Canada with respect and with gratitude. I choose to reflect on the meaning of respect and the responsibility I share for the sustainability of these lands, as well as how I can do my part to ensure that Indigenous peoples across Canada and the lands they were forced to share with us is centered in my work. I believe that we all have a responsibility to not only acknowledge the grounds on which we are privileged to live and privileged to work, but to also continue to grow our learning of Indigenous realities and Indigenous histories. I share responsibility to restore relationships with the caretakers of this land that is based in peace, friendship, and trust through my commitment to reconciliation, partnership, and understanding. Before we move on, I wanted to take a moment to explore what we're going to be learning together from our webinar today. We're going to start by exploring how our preferences influence how we make decisions. Then we're going to dive into learning about how we can learn to navigate our logic mind or our emotion mind in a more balanced way. We're going to discuss how we can tune towards our emotions or our heart centers or our intuitions to help guide us through this process, as well as we're going to explore what happens when we're able to integrate logic and emotion. When those two mind states come together, they create access to what's called the wise mind. And so we're going to look at what it means to weave in that insight and that wisdom within the decision-making process. And then lastly, we're going to explore other valuable tools that we can add to our decision-making toolkit that can allow us to access movement, access clarity, access next steps and directions when we might be experiencing uncertainty or stuckness or feeling indecisive. From there, we're going to open the virtual space for questions and then tie everything back together by revisiting a couple of takeaways and key points. So let's get started. Decision making. I invite you to think about from the moment you woke up today and leading up to you attending this webinar, how many decisions you've made. I think that really captures the fact that we make a lot of decisions during the course of our days. Sometimes these decisions might feel more automatic, maybe more natural, maybe don't require as much thought, whereas there might be decisions that you can recall maybe experiencing earlier in your day-to-day that required more consideration, more reflection, require you to really sit and evaluate what that decision means and could potentially look like for you. What can tip the balance sometimes when it comes to the ease or the difficulty in which we make our decisions is how complex they are. If they require they come with high stakes, or they are impactful to ourselves and or the folks around us, that can shift the complexity. That can make decision making a lot more difficult. When we are first faced with making a decision, we often encounter it with our judgment. We kind of look at what's happening and try to engage in assessment and evaluation to help determine how best to proceed. And by that I mean, we might try to go back to the past and see if we can obtain or extract information that could help us determine what direction might be the most beneficial for us in the present. Or we might jump time zones into the future and try to predict or try to forecast what possible outcomes might look like based on decisions that we make today. There's also a really neat exercise, as you can see on this slide, and I invite you, if you have space during your day after a meeting or after a webinar or later on this week, to really reflect on, maybe if you have half an hour or an hour, all the decisions that you make within that time, because that can really help capture how much judgment and how much evaluation are you putting into the decisions that you make each day, and what is influencing that thought for you. Additionally, when we make our decisions, when we determine our outcomes and courses of actions, we might gravitate in different directions, or we might find that we have a tendency to lean more on one mind state than another. We might be folks who really connect with our hearts. We might be folks who connect with our feelings, our values, our intuition, our intuitive sense when it comes to how to carve out next steps or outcomes. Or on the other end of the continuum, we might be folks who really resonate with getting those facts, getting that concrete information. We might be folks who are connected more to making decisions from a place of intellect, from a place of logic, from a place of data. It can be really helpful to know, what mind state do you tend to gravitate towards? Because what that tells us is, where does our strength lie? What is familiar to us? Where do we find ourselves to be the most comfortable when it comes to how we make our decisions? To dive deeper into that, let's explore what it's like if we resonate with being more logic-minded, or being more intellectual or focused on facts when it comes to making decisions. What this tells us is, we might be more cool-headed. And why I say that is, when we're logic-minded, we can spend a lot of more time in making decisions. So that process might look a lot longer for us compared to other folks. We can spend a lot of time gathering a lot of information, a lot of tangible, technical, and factual information, because we want to make sure that we're making the best rational decision possible. When we're in logic mind, it really equips us to be task-oriented, to be really good at solving problems. However, where it gets tricky is that our logic mind doesn't consider how we feel about anything. It doesn't take our emotions into consideration. And that could be impactful, because it's not taking into consideration how we feel about a possible solution, or whether that solution aligns with our values, aligns with our goals. So in that way, it can feel validating of our emotions. I also recognize that in certain workplaces and organizations, and I extend this invitation to you to reflect on, if you are joining us today from a workplace, logic mind and being quite intellectually focused can be a state of mind that's quite emphasized in the workplace. And sometimes what that can create is loss of the emotional experience, loss of that insight and that wisdom, as well as that impact. How we break out a lot of logic mind, how we can speed up that process and create more room for our emotions to be accessed and felt, is by looking at how we can speed up the decision-making process. Because as I mentioned before, logic-minded folks, they like to take their time. They like to gather all that information. And to break out of that cycle, what the ask is making decisions based on less available information. And that might feel uncomfortable because logic-minded folks have that tendency to have access to a lot of information. So we're essentially asking them to do the opposite of what they would normally turn towards. With that being said, it's also really important to ask ourselves and become really curious around what fuels that need to gather all that information. Where does that come from? What's the mind underneath? And for some of us, whether we're logic-minded or not, we can have critical voices or critical parts of us that can be really fearful of making mistakes. These parts of us might view making mistakes as being disastrous. And by exploring ways that we can break out, that also gives us the opportunity to redefine and recreate what it means to make a mistake, and to shift that narrative to be more focused on experimentation and how experiments sometimes they don't result in what we intended to. When we're trying new approaches, the focus is trying something new, and on extracting the information that we're able to learn from that experience, from that experiment. It gives us that opportunity to step out of doing mistakes as being disastrous. Now, on the other end of the continuum again, we have our emotion-minded folks. And when we're in our emotion mind, if this resonates with you, the idea of being hot-headed, I say that with a little bit of hesitation because I feel like it's kind of a layered description. However, I wanted to describe it like that because when I mentioned being logic-minded to be associated with being more cool-headed, when we're emotion mind, we can notice that our body temperature elevates. We might associate it with feeling more warm or feeling hot, especially if there's the presence of intense emotions. Because what we know is a function of emotions is that it prepares us to take action by pumping our bodies full of energy so that when we need to, we're equipped. We have access to abundance of energy. We can take action in the ways that we need to, which is why if you think about maybe an instance or a situation where when you were in emotion mind, you might have noticed yourself feeling a lot warmer than you typically do. When we're in our emotion mind, we don't have access to the same sense of being able to problem solve and to plan and think ahead as we do when we're in logic mind. That's because emotion mind is very much focused on the present, really focused on the present moment and what we need or what feels right. The thing about emotion mind is that because it's so focused on the now, it doesn't necessarily see long term. It doesn't necessarily see the whole picture. And so what that thing is, what feels right in the moment, is not able to see what that can mean for us long term. It also can sometimes shift our perspectives. It can distort our perspectives in ways because our emotions can sometimes be really focused on survival, which can influence how we see and experience things. To dive into that further, the ask is different for emotion-minded folks because naturally, emotion-minded folks can tend to make decisions really quickly. How we step out or break out of emotion mind is by slowing things down, really changing the pace in which we move through what that process is like. What can be really helpful for us if this is the mind state we notice ourselves operating mostly from is when we're faced with a decision or a situation or evaluating a couple of different options is to take a step back, is to give ourselves space. And within that pause, within that spaciousness, that can be an opportunity for us to focus on really attending and taking care and regulating our emotions so that we can return to that process, but from a place where we're feeling more grounded, more regulated, more centered. By slowing down and accessing that pause and using our tools, that can also reignite the connection to allow us to see the whole picture, to allow us to not only see the short term and the now, but also to see the long term of the decisions that we make today. We can also explore tools and ways we can turn to the heart or turn to our intuition or our center to help bring clarity when we notice ourselves maybe stuck and not really sure which option is the best, which option matches my wants, my needs, where do I go from here? Something that I often encourage folks is to write things down. And why I say that is sometimes we can have thoughts that feel and sound a certain way when they're within our minds. And when we have an opportunity to write those thoughts out, now we can see them. And that can bring a different experience, a different sensation to that information. And so one way that we can help access our heart when we're faced with multiple options or possibilities is through writing them down. And I invite you to, if you're faced currently in a situation and you're exploring different possibilities, to write them down. And I invite you from there to really sink in and really immerse yourself in what that outcome, what that possibility is like, what it looks like for you, what it would feel like if there are other folks involved in that. How would they feel? How would they behave? You can do this, you can repeat this practice for each option that you chose. And at the end, I invite you to reflect on, is there one that stands out to you? Is there one that feels the most aligned to you? And maybe alignment for you could look like, is there an absence of fear or absence of anxiety? Is there an option that feels or provides you with clarity? And that can help provide us with direction when we're feeling stuck and not really certain of which avenue to go in. It can also be really helpful to bring our emotions on board when we're faced in a situation where we're evaluating options, and to really resist that urge to either gather all the information, gather all those facts, or focusing on what feels right in the moment. And how we can achieve that is through focusing on our thoughts, really observing what's coming up for us. What thoughts are coming up for you around the decision that you might need to make? And we're going to acknowledge the thought, not from a place of judgment, not from a place of evaluation, not from a place of criticism. We're going to notice and observe. And this provides a chance for our hearts and our heads to work together without necessarily being focused on coming up with a specific outcome. It's an opportunity to integrate both through noticing. That could look like maybe noticing if there are thoughts of uncertainty around showing up for you, rather if there are thoughts around maybe a need that's there, maybe a need for a second opinion, really being open and receptive to what shows up for you. Additionally, it can be really helpful to listen to our bodies, because our bodies hold a lot of information. Our bodies, our hearts, our centers. As we know, our minds and our bodies, they're communicating quite frequently with each other throughout the course of our day. And the physical sensations we can experience can also provide clues to what decision we might gravitate towards or what decision feels the most aligned for us. If we're sitting in a decision or possibilities or outcomes and we notice a softening or an opening, that can be indicative of a yes. Whereas if we're noticing a tensing or a tightness or a contracting, that can be more indicative of no. And that can capture how much information we can access when we tune in and listen to our thoughts, to the sensations in our physical bodies, and to our hearts. It can be really helpful to lean into our values when it comes to decision making. Lean into our morals, our values, who we are, and what we stand for. Because when we're able to make decisions from that place, it can also help us find a sense of confidence and certainty around the outcomes when our decision making is guided by our values. I also want to mention that I know that sometimes when we make decisions, they might kind of feel like they're out of our hands. And I'll explain more about how I mean. For example, when we make decisions within the context of our workplaces, sometimes it might feel like we don't have as much agency in that process, especially when there are policies, when there are procedures that kind of take precedence on what decision is made. And when those situations are reality for us, I also want to explore, is there any opportunities to still collaborate, to bring our heart on board to collaborate? Whether that's how or the action or the ways in which that procedure is enacted, or the language that's used, or who's there, or the space, how the space is held. How can we look at opportunities continuously to bring our heart on board, even during those moments when it might feel like there's no space at the table for them? We spoke about our emotion mind and our logic mind. Now we're going to move into what it would be like for us if both became integrated and weaved within each other. Because what that would create for us is access to our wise mind. Our wise mind can also be called our intuition, our center, and you're going to hear me refer to it by a couple of names. Our wise mind is kind of the best both worlds, if I could say so, because it encompasses our emotions, our ability to problem solve, be task-oriented, our ability to see that big picture, see that whole picture, which is really ideal. The other thing about wise mind, it allows us to access that inner guidance, that inner wisdom, that inner knowing that can give us direction when we're feeling uncertain. The other piece I really want to speak to about wise mind is that, although I mentioned, I said being in a wise mind, it's ideal because it's access to all these things, which is true. However, being in a wise mind doesn't guarantee comfort. We can be in wise mind and also experience discomfort at the same time. Because although wise mind gives us direction, we still might experience a need or the urge for things that feel easier or to be less painful or for the answer to be different. And at the same time, we still might know that truth. And that truth could look like the decision and the direction that your wise mind has come up with for you is the best way forward for you. Now that we know what the wise mind is, how do we access it? How do we get there? What's next? All valid questions. And one of the ways that we can access our wise mind is through the breath. On our inhale, we can ask our wise mind a question, and on our exhale, listen to the answer. And if we engage in that practice and we don't notice an answer come up for us right away, that's okay. That's absolutely all right. We can try again a different time. What we're looking for in listening to that answer or finding that answer is not having it be forced and not having it require effort. And if I could share an example, this could be like if you had an experience where you felt yourself really, really pondering, really reflecting on something, a question, a dilemma, and then all of a sudden the answer comes to you. I know that might sound a little mysterious. However, that would be similar to the effortless that you would put into finding that answer or listening or finding that answer when you're in wise mind. It can also be helpful to participate in things that go around you, because sometimes there can be things that get in the way of us hearing our wise mind, of us hearing that inner wisdom. Because sometimes there can be a lot of chatter in our minds. We might have a running to-do list there. We might have a critical or perfectionist voice that's there. We might be also hearing our self-talk. And by participating in activities that provide a sense of grounding, what that also creates is a sense of inner peace and quietude and spaciousness. And what that creates is more room for us to listen and hear that answer when our wise mind provides it to us. Let's move into some additional tools that we can add to our toolkit. Firstly, let's talk about our emotions. It can be really useful to not only identify what we're feeling, but also why we're feeling. And why I emphasize that is sometimes we might find ourselves repressing our emotions. We might find ourselves turning away from them, avoiding them, engaging in certain behaviors to try to get rid of them. And the thing about our emotions is that they're working really hard. They have a message they're trying to give us. And by continuously pushing them away, what we can end up doing is allowing them to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and louder and louder and louder until we're no longer to ignore them. And by being open to our emotions and being receptive to our emotions, that allows us to receive the messages that are there for us. And those messages can increase our awareness, increase our knowledge, and add to our clarity in what our next step could look like. Again, if we are feeling intense emotions, if we're experiencing distress or feeling dysregulated, taking a step back, giving ourselves space and time, that can always be really, really helpful, because that can allow us to approach or return to a situation or to a decision from a place of response as opposed to a place of reaction. When we're able to take a step back, maybe pull some tools from our own individual coping toolkits, so we can self-soothe, we can regulate. That can be really helpful, especially when our emotions are high or emotions are intense, because that can really influence how we see, perceive, and interpret situations. We notice ourselves having a tendency to speed up the decision-making process. And those are always opportunities to bring our logic mind on board, because we know one thing our logic mind likes really well is taking our time. If you notice that urge come up for you, bringing logic mind on board again will help slow it down, because that's logic mind's natural cadence. And by slowing it down, that will also provide more room to cultivate perspective. Sometimes when we're faced in certain situations, the lines can blur. And by that I mean, sometimes certain situations can blur the past and the present together. And that can also shift how we see a certain situation. So it can be helpful to look at how we can create separation and really define and identify how is the past and the present different, to really ensure that how we're interpreting a situation is based on the time zone or the time period that we're in, because what the past was like for us can look drastically different from the present, and how that influences our decisions. If we're faced with something really, really important or impactful, and we have access to additional time, take that time. We might need to take that time. If you are faced with a decision and it might come with a high impact to you or to your team, or to folks around you, and you have that space, take that space. That's absolutely okay. Sometimes it can be daunting to make decisions. Sometimes we might feel afraid of not only making the wrong decision, but the decision that we do make, whether it might harm someone else, whether it might hurt someone else. And that can really add a different layer and weight to our ability to make choices. When we're really able to lean in to the decision-making process from a place of compassion, what that will allow us to do is really, again, stay connected to that big picture, and also how our decisions are going to impact others, what's going to be the most beneficial to not only to ourselves, but to others as well. And that can help work towards soothing the parts of us that might hold that fear of whether or not our choices are going to create harm for someone else. It can also be really important, again, to stay connected to your values, because sometimes the outcome might be comfortable, it might be uncomfortable. However, if it's guided by our values, what that gives us certainty of is that it's the best possible choice or the best possible decision for ourselves. What can also happen when we're faced with decisions is wanting to make it perfect, to really get it right. And that can really slow down the process and create barriers, because the reality is there are going to be instances when we need to make a decision either with limited information or with a limited timeline. If we're faced with a deadline or we need to make a decision on the spot. And by gathering an abundance of information, what that can do is slow down that process. And additionally, that can lead to overthinking, which can create anxiety and doubt, which can also hinder that process. And if this is something that resonates with us, how we can move through it is by really setting limits, and not only just setting those limits, honoring those limits that we set of how long we're going to participate in that gathering or research process. And once that time is up, we move forward with our decision. We can also outsource our decision making. We can hand it over to someone else to make for us. And initially that might feel good. It might kind of feel like a relief, like, oh, that's not mine anymore. when we think about that process, though, in more depth, when we're making a decision, we're making it based on our values, based on our goals. And that's unique to each and every one of us as individuals. So when we hand decisions over to someone else to make, when we get that back, it's not reflective of us. It's not reflective of our needs, our values, our goals, and can create more distress for us because it doesn't align with who we are. When we notice that urge coming up for us to lean externally or to access connection when it comes to a choice that we're facing, it can be helpful to shift our focus or to shift what our intention is for that connection. There can be an invitation to use that space as an opportunity to gain clarity on what it is that you want, on what it is that you need, on what feels right for you, as opposed to using that space or connection as an invitation for advice, using it as a space to really tune into your inner compass, because that's something that can be impacted when we really rely on others to make our decisions. We can lose our ability to trust ourselves. We can lose our abilities to listen and follow our own wisdom and our own compass to create direction. It can be really difficult to figure out our choices or to figure out outcomes when we're really kind of stuck in that worst case scenario. When that's the only picture we can see, that can create a lot of anxiety, and that can lead us into a space where we put all of our energy in preparing how we're going to respond or how we're going to cope with that outcome or that situation. What that also prevents us from doing is seeing other possibilities, which also might be true, that also might be there. And if this is something you've experienced, I invite you to, again, pen to paper or typing on a computer, write out different scenarios or different outcomes for choices or decisions that you might face, to be able to see what else might be more likely, to see what else could happen. And that could help us not get us drawn into that worst case scenario. Because maybe that could be true, maybe not. However, it also discounts the possibility of other realities at the same time. So I invite you to look at ways to conserve your energy and really brainstorm all the outcomes. And once you're able to do that, that can allow you to see what is more likely versus what is not. Lastly, if you find yourself at a crossroads and not feeling certain which direction to go into, we can use our values as a guide. It can be really helpful to dive in and reflect on what your values are and what are your top values, really staying connected to what that truth looks like for you. When it comes to decision making, and if you're feeling uncertain about which way to go, it can be helpful to reflect on and to think about what decision would be the most reflective, or what decision would honor what your values are. Excuse me. Now we've come to the end of our webinar today, and I wanted to take a moment to pause and check in to see if folks had any questions. I invite you to enter your questions into the chat, or if you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can also provide your answers verbally as well. So I'll give everyone a moment, and I'm also going to take a peek at our chat. Okay, so I think everyone's good with questions. So I would like to move on to revisit a couple of key points, takeaways, some information for you to hold on to, keep top of mind. And firstly is really stay connected with, or rather stay connected to what your preferences are when it comes to making decisions. Whether you are someone who could slow down, or if you're someone who could break out of what this process looks like for you to create either more room for your logic mind or more room for your emotion mind. I also want to remind folks that our wise mind is the integration of both. Is when we're able to access our emotion and our logic mind equally. When intense emotions are coming up for us, it's always okay to take a step back, to give ourselves space, to give ourselves time when that is available in the decision-making process. Leaning into your values, staying connected to that big picture, that whole picture, that can help guide us towards making the best decision for ourselves. Additionally, we're going to try to avoid outsourcing our decision making, because we know that when that happens, it's not reflective of ourselves, it's not reflective of our values or our goals. We can use those touch points, that connection, those dialogues to help determine what feels right for us, what feels the most aligned for us. And then lastly, we're going to learn to embrace imperfection in the process, and look at mistakes as learning opportunities. I can't say learning today. Never mind. Thank you so much. We've reached the end of our webinar today. I do want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day to join our webinar. If there is anything that comes up for you, if there's anything you would like to know more about, or if you'd like to provide feedback, you can reach me at wellness@guard.me. Additionally, we do have a couple of more webinars planned before the end of the year. So if you aren't already, I invite you to follow us on our social media platforms. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. I'm just making sure I've named each and every one of them. And you can also find our webinars posted on our YouTube channel. And so, yes, I want to say thank you so much for joining. It was a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to share this information with you. And I hope to see you soon at our next one. I hope everyone has an amazing rest of your day. Thank you again.